you. And you would get to closed captioning by going to the live transcript tab at the bottom of your Zoom window, and then clicking show subtitles. So if that's something that would be helpful for you, please do use that. As Franklin mentioned, there'll be a free draw at the end of the webinar, so stay tuned and stay right till the end to make sure that you qualify. Also, there's a questions and answers pane that some of you have found already, and that's where you're going to be posting your questions throughout our couple of hours together today. Please do put your questions in as the presentations are going on. We are having lots of great speakers today, so something might occur to you with one speaker, and with time permitting, we will pose those questions at the end of each speaker's presentation. So please do post them in the questions and answers, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can today. The agenda for today is, it was posted on the website, but here it is. We're just doing some introductions, and then we'll have a 10-minute presentation by each of our panelists. Then we're hoping to have a good 40 minutes of discussion with questions and answers, and getting into the nitty-gritty of this topic. And then we'll wrap it up with a prize draw at the end. So I would like to introduce our speakers, and hopefully you guys can come on camera as I'm doing your introductions. We're going in alphabetical order, for lack of a better way to do this. So I'm starting with Russell Cross, who's a speech pathologist and a language system product manager at PRC-Saltillo, a psychology and linguistics graduate from the University of Lancaster in the UK with a post-grad qualification from the University of Central England. He's worked in the field of AAC since 1984. Russell is a co-author of the Unity series of language application programs, the author of Core Word software, and the developer of the Realize Language AAC data analysis website. He's a member of the Royal College of Speech Language Therapists and Asha and Isaac, and on the ATIA Research Committee. So welcome, Russell. Dr. Melanie Fried-Oken is a professor of neurology, biomedical engineering, and otolaryngology at the Oregon Health and Science University. She's a director of the research project Realizing Expressive Knowledge in Everyone with Communication Impairments. As a leading international clinician and researcher in the field of AAC, she provides expertise about assistive technology for persons with acquired disabilities who cannot speak or use writing for expression. She's the principal investigator on federally funded grants to research communication technologies for people with dementia, ALS, and other neurodegenerative diseases, including NIH grants on brain interfaces for communication. So welcome, Melanie. Next, we have Dave Hershberger. So Dave is the CEO of PRC-Saltillo, which is based in the US. His career has been dedicated to assistive technology. He trained as an electrical engineer, and Dave developed AAC devices for PRC during the 80s and the early 90s. He then founded Saltillo Corporation in 1996. And over the past few years, he's brought the two companies together under the PRC-Saltillo umbrella. Next, we have Phil McIntyre, and he's a manager and assistive technology lead at TechAbility. It's a service that supports specialist settings in the UK. He consults and delivers assistive technology training to colleges and adult support providers. Prior to this, Phil managed the assistive technology team at Beaumont College, a highly specialized college for post-19 students. He's also delivered training and support to every post-16 college in Scotland, and worked as an AT trainer for inclusive technology, and has been an assistive technologist since before the term even made it to the UK. So welcome to Phil. And then next, we have Dr. David Niemeijer. He is the CEO and founder of AssistiveWare, which is based in Amsterdam. With over 20 years of experience, David is a pioneer in the field of AAC and assistive technology. He's created software for people with physical, visual, and communication challenges, including the award-winning Protocol2Go software. Today, AssistiveWare serves over 450,000 customers worldwide with products in many, many languages. David has presented at major international assistive technology and AAC conferences, including AAC, ASHA, Closing the Gap, Communication Matters, CSUN, ATIA, and ISAC. And last but not least, we have Alyssa Zisk, an autistic doctoral candidate in interdisciplinary neurosciences at the University of Rhode Island in the US. They have several forms of experience with AAC, personal part-time use, research in the context of AAC for speaking autistic adults, and research in the context of brain-computer interfaces for people with ALS. Alyssa is an experienced teacher, both face-to-face and online, and their apparent lack of eye contact is not an artifact of webinars or camera placement. So welcome to all of you very much. So having introduced all of our panelists in great detail, we'll now move on and start our presentations with Russell.
Okay, thank you. Let's put my video on for a second. Thank you very much. If I could have, and there it is. Okay, screen 2. Yep, there we go. Okay, thank you for the introduction, and hopefully folks are going to have an exciting and entertaining couple of hours with us here. As I say, my name is Russell Cross. I'm the Language Systems Product Manager at PRC-Saltillo. And really what I want to talk about here is the value of just data collection in general, but specifically for language sampling analysis. So what I'm going to do first is to take a look at what I think is important about the value of assessment. And I'm taking the information here from the preferred practice patterns for the profession of speech language pathology in ASHA. Wonderful alliteration with all those P's. And what the preferred patterns of the profession indicates is that a comprehensive speech language pathology assessment includes some of these components. And I picked out some of the ones that I think are important for us to bear in mind. And we talk here about standardized and or non-standardized measures of specific aspects of speech, spoken and non-spoken language, cognitive communication, and swallowing function, including observation and analysis of work samples. But the piece I just want to point out there is the notion of non-standard measures and spoken and non-spoken language. But the point here, I think, is that we are looking at the important here of having some sort of measurement in what we do as professionals. I know that in AAC we talk a lot about model, 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 but I also like to think in terms of measure, 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 because that's a way that we can effectively look at what we're doing and see whether what we're doing is in some ways effective. And also the notion of non-standard, because although we talk a lot about using standardized assessments, for our population, most of the time, standardized assessments don't always work. And so we have to look at non-standard. And non-standard doesn't mean bad. Non-standard doesn't mean correct. It just means that we're not using norms, etc. But it's part of what we do as a profession. We look at measurement and we look at non-standard events. We want to identify the potential for effective intervention strategies and compensations. So as a result of what we do by assessment, we will be also looking at what we can learn from that in order to see what we want to do next. Then we're looking at the follow-up services to monitor communication and swallowing status and ensure appropriate intervention and support for individuals. So that's the next step. You know, we do our evaluation, our assessment, we decide what we're going to do, and then we have to continue to monitor in some way the progress of clients. Now, just to contrast with that one, as you can tell by my accent, I'm not a native of the US, even though I live here in Ohio. But in the UK, we do have there the Standards of Proficiency for Speech and Language Therapists in the HCPC, the Health and Care Professions Council. And they have some similar ideas here about what we should be doing and what's good practice, is that we have to be able to gather appropriate information. We have to be able to undertake and record thorough, sensitive, and detailed assessment and using appropriate techniques and equipment. And that we need to be able to administer, record, score, and interpret a range of published and self-generated assessment tools to describe and analyze service users' abilities and needs using, where appropriate, phonetic transcription, linguistic analysis, instrumental analysis, and psycholinguistic assessment. The ones that I'm typically most interested in here are certainly the linguistic analysis and psycholinguistic assessment, and instrumental analysis in terms of what tools can we use to help that process. There are a couple of things that we, again, have to be aware of as professionals. And here I refer to the ASHA Code of Ethics, 2016, page 3, this notion of informed consent. And so most of us who've been around for a long time, this notion is ingrained in the way we work, to the point that we sometimes forget we do it. But obviously, when we're doing any sort of intervention with clients, there is the assumption that we should have some form of informed consent. So from the very first time I walked into a clinic in 1986, probably it was the first time, anything that happened in the clinic stayed in the clinic. And also what we came to decisions about with our clients and with their parents, etc., was that there was consent in what we were doing. And confidentiality is a second strand to this one, and that we should be protecting the confidentiality of both our professionals and persons who are served with what we say. So this also extends to the fact that what do we talk about with our colleagues? It's appropriate for us to talk with our colleagues about individuals, but there are limits on what we can do. You know, we really don't want to be going down to the pub and talking about our clients, but within the sphere of our clinical practice, when we're talking about things like second opinions or working with our colleagues, then those interactions, you know, are part of this whole system of confidentiality. So I like to think that we should also always bear in mind those things there of informed consent, confidentiality, and those will help guide us in what we are doing. So why, in fact, would we bother collecting the data in the first place? And again, I have a reference here to an article if you want to get a hold of it, Missing Realities of Language Sample Analysis. And I took this quote, I sort of like the quote, language sample analysis is like flossing your teeth. It's something we all know we should do, but the majority of us neglect to do so on a regular basis. And those that are flossing regularly may not be doing it correctly. Are you sliding the floss up and down each tooth? Well, there is an overwhelming support from clinical texts, journal articles, and our national organization for the use of language sample analysis in clinical practice. That reality is that many clinicians do not use it consistently. I'm just maybe a little over the top what we're saying here, but I think a lot of people do at some level do some sort of analysis. But the point really here is that there is value to be gained by collecting language data. And for any child receiving speech language therapy services, it's essential for progress monitoring. So why would we want to see how well someone is doing with their AAC system in January? And then why would we want to look in February and then March and April? Because when we take these little samples, we're looking to see if there has been progress over that period of time. And a little scary sometimes is how well is someone responding to our intervention? And it's one of the toughest lessons that we all learn very early on, is that we work with clients and then we find that what we're doing isn't working. And that's always hard to take, but it's not a measure of some intrinsic failure in yourself. What we've got to remember that if our intervention is not working, then we need to go back as professionals and work out why. So you take on board the fact that this isn't working. What do we have to do to change it? And that's the professional response. And therefore, when we looked at our data sampling, we can look at the treatment that then goes with that one. And this helps us and informs us of what we might want to be doing next. How can we collect data? Well, I like to tell people that now I've hit a certain age that I can say that data collection for language analysis is as old as the profession of speech pathology itself. I'm not that old, but it starts way back with pen and paper. We collect data and have been collecting data forever. I still use a pen and paper. Cassette tapes, some of us have done that. Videotapes, digital recorders, and you'll see I'm going up in the years here, smartphones, and then to AAC devices, because some of those actually have optional features that you can turn on if you wish, which will do data collection there. But all of these are the same underlying idea, which is collecting data in order to inform our practice and to look at what we can see our client is capable of doing now and what we can do to improve their ability to communicate. All of these just are different types of technology, different types of medium, but the underlying idea is that data is what we're looking for. So what actions can we take? Well, the nature of data security and privacy are not static. There are changes in attitudes, in technology, and legal expectations, and these are constantly in flux. So our expectations for privacy and security are very different today than they were, say, 30 years ago, when security was basically putting my file back in a cabinet and locking the door. And I think there are 4 areas in which the AAC community, and those of us who are listening now, and at the end, I'm hoping people have some great ideas here, can work towards improving the issues with data security and privacy. There's a level of education, which is aimed at professionals in the field and how they can improve their practice. So let's talk to people about how they can help secure data and how do they maintain privacy and work with their clients. There's education for the general community. This is like the raising awareness that we do, but we can continue to do, and to talk about some of the issues that of privacy for people who use AAC. There are improvements we can make in technology to enhance data security. So the addition, as most folks have, of some sort of passwording systems, encryption systems. There are ways that we can look at how technology can be enhanced. And then there are, adherence to legal standards and lobbying activities. So there are things that we all have to do and cannot do from a legal standpoint. These things change, but sometimes we have to lobby to make change as well. And these 4 things are actions I think that we can all take together at some point. So let me end that slideshow there. I think I have just had my time. There we go. Let me come back in.
Fantastic. Thanks,
I think I
Russell.
unshare my screen. There we go.
Perfect. I don't see any questions posted just yet in the question panel, so we will move on to Melanie.
Good morning, afternoon, evening. I am joining you from Portland, Oregon, in the United States, where we often have rain at this time, but we also have lots of hope and rainbows. I'm trying to move my screen and not having any success. During our short time together, I'm going to try to discuss 3 points. The need for and challenges of an AAC large word database, privacy concerns that are expressed by end users in a qualitative study that we're currently implementing, and then my clinician views as I staff an AAC adult clinic. Let's start. Let's talk first about large AAC databases, and I will maintain that we need to build an AAC large word database that includes the words and phrases used by people who rely on AAC devices. While a personalized lexicon can be built over time for a single device, the current databases for word prediction and increased speed of production do not adequately represent the end users or their lexica. But as we build this large word database, we run into a dilemma. Will creating a large word database infringe on individual privacy? In my short time together, I'm going to ask more questions and not provide any answers. So let's look at current large databases that are used. Language sources for most AAC devices are based on multi-million word databases, and they come from the field of natural language processing and include databases called Switchboard, This American Life, Enron emails, and New York Times articles. The words and phrases rely on the language from limited population groups, often highly educated professional literate adults, and language for particular contexts, often for employment, news, culture, arts. Algorithms that take these databases as a starting point privilege certain kinds of communication and potentially neglect others. For example, slang or personal terms may be auto-corrected to formal language. The choice of database could produce language predictions that do not represent individuals from certain groups, especially those with complex communication needs or end users with limited or developing literacy skills. All of you know of funny, inappropriate instances when the language model did not predict the words that were needed for end users. The lexica used within AAC devices may contain words and phrases that are not commonly present in current, very large databases. Let's think of some examples. The wheelie. If you go to your computer and look at images of the wheelie, you will find stunt cars, motorcycles, and bicycles. There was not one image of a wheelchair wheelie in the entire image search that I did. Yet that's the word that we need. Another example, think of the family that uses English as a second language, and they support a daughter who uses an English AAC device with word prediction. Whose language is being predicted? How well are her family members and partners understanding her messages? So I think an AAC language database is critical. If we do start collecting large word databases from people who rely on AAC, how do we maintain their privacy and still increase the frequency of lexicon-specific items? I certainly don't have answers. I have a lot of questions. Also, how do we influence the bi-directional vocabulary needs for both the speaker and listener in an AAC database? Often, many of the end users are answering questions. So the vocabulary that would be in their database comes from the environment, the context, and the questions that are being asked. And we must find a way to capture that vocabulary as well. So those are my initial thoughts within 10 minutes of why we need a database and some of the challenges to it. I'd like now to move to privacy concerns from potential end users. So we asked, what are some ethical issues involved in building personalized language models? And would you like your vocabulary stored in an AAC device? We're funded to conduct a study where we presented hypothetical value-based vignettes to 15 people in semi-structured interviews and to 50 people through online surveys. So based on the need for data, Russell, we have data from 75 individuals. They were adults who experience a neurodegenerative disease and may choose an AAC brain-computer interface communication system in the future. They had diagnoses that ranged from ALS to primary lateral sclerosis, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Parkinson's disease plus syndromes. They all were shown videos of a person using BCI for communication, so they understood the concept of communication using a brain-computer interface. A few of the participants already used an AAC device. So we asked them, we would show them a hypothetical value-based scenario. They were longer than what I'm going to share with you now, but I have a limited time. So I want you to consider a husband and wife where one member of the couple has a degenerative disease and they decided to seek counsel from a lawyer to determine if they should separate and divorce. At the same time, they have a daughter who's coming home from school. And the end user says, when are you having DI? And you and I expect dinner, but unfortunately, the word prediction, the language model produces divorce. And here we have a difficult situation. The couple had not yet decided to discuss this with their daughter. So we would discuss a hypothetical value-based scenario with our participants and then ask them a bunch of questions. Today, I'm going to give you just a taste. I'm going to give you responses to 4 questions from the interview data, so 15 individuals. We are currently interpreting the full data set, so thanks for your patience. We would ask, would you want your private words stored? And here are responses from the 15 individuals. I understand in people's lives, there are things you want to keep private. I would go for a less private way of approaching this. I'd say that I'd err on the side of full disclosure, and I just happen to think people don't have to worry about privacy. I wonder if there's a way that the vocabulary storage program can be a little bit less personal. You can still get the language, but you wouldn't get personal information about family members because these patients are going to be gone someday. And the people who are left dealing with all this personal information could really get impacted quite seriously. There could be a downside to having all that information. I would think a user would be able to delete any unfavorable words from the vocabulary before using it, thereby lessening the chance to be put in a compromised situation. For the system to work, it's going to have to know as much about you as it can. In other words, it's going to know that I tend to use this word in this context. If you don't tell it that you do that, then it's never going to do that because it doesn't know, right? You're going to have to give up a lot of personal information in order for a system to work well. Storing my language is personal, but for me, I don't mind sharing this stuff with others because at some point in my life, maybe I would know, probably because I have a neurological illness, that I'm going to need something to help me communicate with other people, maybe one day. Probably if I share my what do I feel, or what do I know, or some personal information, how to communicate, it would be easier to have somebody around me understand what I'm trying to say or to send a message. I don't take it so personal. I'm okay with it. From my perspective, it will help a lot. We also asked individuals, should you change what language is stored? It's important to edit information given to researchers to take out personal info, names, etc. I would want to edit out names, etc. to protect family and friends. There are certain things that are part of my personal care or stuff that I prefer not to be made public. Yeah, there could be sensitive material in there that I may not want people to see. I personally think that as far as memories or feelings, that I need to leave much behind. I would edit my emails before turning them over. If I didn't make the decision to stop swearing or to swear more, why should I change it now? Because that's what people around me know and understand me to be. Should we value privacy, we asked? As far as information and information sharing and all that, I'm not bothered by someone getting into even my old love letters or communication between my wife and I, or somebody even getting into my computer. It's like, help yourself, seems like a waste of your time. So for me, what it comes down to, I certainly don't want them to get into my bank account, but beyond that, I'm pretty much an open book. My wife's a lot more concerned about security. I mean, I want the intended recipient to only get what's intended for them. I don't necessarily want Sister A to hear Sister B's letter. That's my only concern. There's not much that I keep from other people, and I'm not as concerned as I used to be about how people feel about me or what they think about me. And I know that sometimes that can be awkward for them, or even for me sometimes, but not so much for me anymore. So I've kind of given up on being concerned about other people's impressions, although I do. Again, I would like to be able to convey my thoughts as accurately as possible. Should you give consent to store your words? You're dealing with a personal document. Even if you're giving someone else this information, that needs to be with their permission. And finally, yes, anything that you shared or donated, you would need to understand that that would be public information. I'd like to thank my collaborators, Erin Klein and Michelle Kinsella, for conducting the interviews and analyzing the data. Stay tuned. We'll have a lot more to share with you about storing vocabulary as reported by end users. The last thing I want to share with you is my clinician's view. So you've already heard my view as a researcher on development of assistive technologies and the need for the databases. You've heard my views as a clinical researcher asking end users what they think about privacy. So now I'm wearing my hat as a clinician. And I have 4 points that I'd like you to walk away with. First, donated devices must have a fast and easy way to wipe the device clean of all stored vocabulary and images before giving it to another client. Loaner devices from manufacturers must be wiped clean of vocabulary as well as images before they are loaned to others. Clinic devices must obtain informed consent if personal pages, both vocabulary and all photos, are to be shared with potential end users. And finally, devices should have password protection for each user. That means if you have a multi-user device in the clinic, for each user, there should be a separate password. And that will get us started to better privacy. Well, I raised some thoughtful questions and issues. Thanks for listening. On to the next presenter.
Melanie, you've kind of lit up the questions and answers. Can you take just a couple before we move on?
Sure. Can you see me now?
Yeah, we can see you. So there's a few comments that I'll just read out so that we don't lose them as the conversation goes on. Someone is letting us know that in the state of Illinois, there's a new guideline regarding Student Online Personal Protections Act, and anything that requires a sign-in or data tracking features has language from the vendor in the schools regarding privacy. So that was one comment. There's a question about your sample size, Melanie. It's somebody that uses AAC that's asking why such a small sample base. There's a lot more people using AAC out there. Do you have a comment on that?
This is about the 75 people that we used that were participants in our study. and only a few of them relied on AAC. That was our decision, was to include individuals with neurodegenerative disease, and we wanted to get as many as possible quickly. So that's what we started with.
Okay. Yeah, the question goes on to
Tracy?
say, I would like to know how speaking people can speak for AAC users.
So we were asking for their perspective as they would be AAC users in the future. They have a disease that's going to probably end up in a non-speaking condition, and we were asking for what they would like as they move forward.
Great.
Tracy, I think maybe we should ask the questions at the end. Was that what Franklin was saying to us?
We were gonna have a few in between, but you're right. You know what? There's a lot, so I'm gonna kind of curate them, and we'll move on to Dave while I sort through the questions. Thanks, Melanie.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope my screen is being shared properly. So hi, I'm Dave Hershberger, and 2020 was a year that emphasized that we live in a data-driven world. By collecting data, interpreting and reacting to it, millions of lives were saved during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, also during the pandemic, illegal access to data enabled scammers to steal more than $30 billion in unemployment benefits in the United States. This is a clear reminder that data enables us to make better decisions and achieve greater success, but illicit access to data can lead to great harm. The perspective that I bring to this discussion is that of a developer and manufacturer of AAC devices. As such, I consider myself a tool maker. Someone has a task to accomplish, and we provide a tool to accomplish it. The most obvious task that someone accomplishes with an AAC device is to express ideas in spoken form. For many children, an AAC device provides their first opportunity to participate in expressive verbal communication. As such, the AAC device also becomes an environment and tool for learning language and developing communication skills. The use of data enables me to develop more effective AAC tools. I'd like to share some examples with you. And with a 10-minute speaking slot, I have limited my coverage to 3 categories of data. For each category, I will speak to the nature of the data, the purpose of the data, and strategies for keeping it secure and private. So let's start with data used to improve device design. To make an effective tool, one needs a deep understanding not only of the task to be accomplished, but the needs, wants, and preferences of those who will be using the tool. When the population for whom the tool is designed is diverse, data collection and analysis helps ensure that the device addresses the needs of the population as a whole, reduces developer preferences, and avoids anecdotal bias. There are various methods to gather this type of data: surveys, interviews, device usage data, etc. As with any data compilation, only data given consensually and voluntarily should be collected. One aspect of this type of data is that although the information comes from individuals, our interest is in the aggregated data. Therefore, we should make every effort to record, store, and analyze it as aggregate anonymous data. Like most groups of humans, there is rich diversity among people who use AAC. While there will be some commonality among the data, there will also be stark contrast. as an AAC manufacturer, we're typically developing tools for individuals with widely varying interests and needs. And this serves as a lead into the next type of data. Data used to customize individual configuration. To serve the diversity of individuals using AAC devices, our devices typically have numerous settings and options that are used to configure the devices for the needs and preferences of each individual. These settings and options are typically often adjusted by humans. For example, the individual using the device, a parent, or a clinician. There are also cases where the device can learn the patterns and preferences of the individual and adjust accordingly. A learning word prediction system may be the most common example of this. In this example, an AAC device monitors the individual word choices and speech patterns, and then uses the data to predict the words that the individual is more likely to use while compiling a sentence. Another example may be to monitor raw data from an eye gaze unit to make adjustments so that hard to hit areas on the screen become more accessible. This type of data is uniquely linked to the individual using the system. However, since the system changes are made without human intervention, this data can remain locked inside the device, inaccessible from the outside. The third type of data that I will mention is data that is used to guide clinical intervention. With the AAC device being an environment in which language learning and communication development occurs, data can be collected that helps the clinician assess the progression of these skills. By assessing this data, a clinician may be able to assess whether a pragmatic communication skill has been mastered or whether it needs more reinforcement. She may be able to see whether a new set of vocabulary words are being used outside of the therapy session. He may also be able to see whether the pre-programmed vocabulary met the needs of a class activity. This type of data is quite different from what we discussed previously. As opposed to the first case where we consider data for device design, this data is helpful because it is unique to a specific individual. And as opposed to the second case where the device was acting on the data, this data is only helpful if a human, an SLP for example, can access, interpret, and act upon the data. It's sort of like when I get blood work done before I visit my doctor. This data is valuable because one, it's unique to me, and two, it's available to my doctor. My doctor can then provide my treatment based on more data than could be observed in a 20-minute office visit. While this type of data is valuable, it's also very private. While I'm glad that my doctor sees my blood analysis, I don't want anyone else to see it. And the same is true for AAC devices. Any data collected for clinical purpose needs to have the same protection for security and privacy. And we believe a number of steps need to be taken. First, full disclosure and consent. We need to be clear about what data is being collected, who has access to it, and how it will be used. A topic that merits further discussion is consent is required, but consent from whom? There's usually no argument that parental consent is needed for a 3-year-old. In the US, 18-year-olds give their own consent. Anyone who has raised a child realizes that in between is a 15-year battle of wills between parents and child. Personally, if there's any debate, I believe it's best to get consent from both. While disclosure and consent are considered prerequisites, we're not guaranteed that these behaviors and practices are always followed. Therefore, as a manufacturer, we take a few additional steps to give the individual from whom the data is collected as much information and control as we can. We use a few strategies to do this. First is opt-in data collection. By default, this type of data collection is turned off. It should only be turned on if one chooses to collect and use the data for clinical intervention. Next, whether to turn the collection off permanently or temporarily when having a private conversation, there needs to be a means to toggle data collection on and off. And furthermore, when data collection is turned on, we provide a visual indicator on the screen as a reminder that data recording is taking place. And in addition to being able to determine whether or not data is being collected, there must also be control over who has access to the data. A privacy password protects the file, and the contents are then only accessible to those with whom the password is shared. And hopefully the files never end up in the wrong hands, but if they do, encryption keeps the content safe. These are some of the strategies we currently employ, but as in many areas of our lives, privacy and security are moving targets. In many ways, data is more vulnerable today than it was 10 years ago, so we've needed to adjust our protocols accordingly. Likewise, the needs 2 years from now will be different than the needs of today. We need to continue to hold conversations like this to address these opportunities, challenges, and strategies as an AAC community. For someone who has been in the field for over 40 years, I find today's world full of promise. With the advance in data collection, data processing, and expert systems, we have an opportunity, some would even say a responsibility, to employ data in improving our technology and practices. But our responsibility to privacy and protection is just as great. Thank you.
I don't see any questions in particular for you just here. Here's one. Any comments on, we'll leave this for a little bit later. So let's continue on, and we'll go to Phil next.
Hi, sorry for the silence there. I'm still here, just sharing my screen. So I'm going to talk to you through a truncated version of a talk I gave at Communication Matters in the UK a couple of years ago now. And really, it's the story of a lost iPad. Now, this comes from when I used to work in a setting for learners with complex needs in post-19 setting. And this is about John. That's not his real picture on screen, but John used and still uses an iPad as his AAC device, running Grid Player, and is a very effective AAC user. And for obvious reasons, John took that wherever he went, which included when he went swimming. Now, he didn't take it in the swimming pool, obviously, but he did need it when he was going to and from the swimming pool, and he required it at all times other than actually in the water.
Sorry, Phil, I'm just going to interrupt you here for a second. It's Franklin. We can't see your screen slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right, let's try that again.
There we go.
There we go. So hopefully everybody can catch up. You've not missed anything. There's just a picture of John and his iPad. So the trouble is that one day on a trip to the swimming pool, John's put his iPad in a locker, and somebody unfortunately left the locker open. And then our stereotypical thief that we can see in our nice thief symbol here came along on the screen, came along and stole his iPad, because people are terrible like that. And I assume they didn't know anything they didn't want John's data. They didn't want anything particularly on the iPad. They just wanted to sell it in the pub, as we say in the UK. Now, so there's a question there really about what data got lost, and that was our first consideration. Initially, the individual staff who worked to support John in his education were worried about the device itself. I was more worried about the data on it. And so you can probably predict the kind of things that got lost on there. There was first name, John's photo, his age and his birthday, because he liked, obviously wanted to talk about that, the school that he'd attended before he came to college, things like town of residence, place of education. names and photos of other students, and names and photos of staff. Now, you could say for those first 6 pieces of information, they're sensitive, if you like. You shouldn't have enough information there to go out and get a car loan in John's name, but it's not good that somebody has access to those. And also there's the names and photos of other students and photos of other staff. So let's have a quick quiz in the chat, thinking about those names and photos of other students and names and photos of staff. This is from an organization where there's about 100 students and say double that amount of staff, probably triple actually, 300 staff, 100 students. How many individuals do you think had to receive a letter to say their data had been compromised? Let's have a quick quiz in the chat. Just plug in a number, see what you think. Oh, we're going in the Q&A here. Oh, we've got some wildly different answers there, between 20 and 400. Well, it's somewhere in between. A total of 117 individuals had to be contacted. Now, thankfully, I intercepted just before the letters were going to go out to tell all these individuals that just a standard letter saying their data had been compromised, and I managed to intercept it and say, no, we need to tell people what data has been compromised because we don't want to people to panic. And essentially, it was people's first name and their photograph. And for most people who got informed of that, they shrugged their shoulders and said, that's fine, it's on Facebook anyway, and they weren't bothered. But legally, we still had to inform them. So if that information's out there and it's on Facebook, then I guess the question is really, why should I be bothered? Well, someone's already noted that this is a recipe for theft and data theft and identity abuse, which is John's data. And then for the other individuals concerned, they may be concerned that their data's out there. So the first thing we need to think about is respect, really. We should be treating others' data as we would our own. Now, John, as an individual who's was using this iPad, doesn't fully understand the risks involved. It genuinely wasn't his fault that the iPad got lost, but we should be treating his data. We shouldn't see it as any less as our own than our own data, and we want it treated. The second reason is also one of prosecution, and this is meant to scare people in the UK that in the UK we have a thing called GDPR. Other countries and have their own data laws, but in the UK you can get fined £17.5 million, which is about $2 million, or 4% of your organization's global turnover, whichever is the greater. So if people aren't bothered about the respect because they're nasty people, they should be bothered about the fact that they could get fined and possibly lose their job. And the reason those fines are so high is really to make people pay attention. And the big reason this has an impact on organizations is because if that device belonged to John himself, it wouldn't be covered under these data laws. That's his device. If he chooses to take photos of people and put them on it, that's entirely up to him. But because the device was a loan device from the college, he was trialing it before he got funding for his own device, it's covered by the law. So all of that means that it's covered. In the UK, we had to report the loss of that device because it was considered a personal data breach, and we had 72 hours to do that. I'd encourage you, if you're in an organization that loans out devices, check your own data laws. I know that most people here probably aren't from the UK or the EU, but check what it means and when you have to report. But what this led me to discuss at college and more widely is the right to speak versus this data law. This data law is strong for a reason, to protect people's rights and privilege and information, but also people have a right to speak, obviously, or we all know that, or we wouldn't be here as part of this. And I think you've got a right to speak about someone, even if they hate you. So if I fall out with, let's pick Russell, sorry, Russell. If I fall out with Russell and then I see him walking down the street, Russell can't stop me in law shouting out, "Hi, Russell, how are you doing?" That's my right. And the same should be true for AAC users. So Russell shouldn't be able to stop an AAC user having his photo and his first name probably on their device if that's what they need to identify him. And it comes, this sort of thing for me comes under the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Also importantly, for individuals who are AAC users, they've got the right to talk about someone, and everybody has the right to talk about someone who needs to be reported. So in the UK, we refer to this as safeguarding and making sure people are kept safe. And if a person's way of identifying someone who might have been abusing them is by their photo on a device, then there shouldn't be anything that overrides that law. Sorry, shouldn't be anything that overrides that right, including data law. So as I said, this is a bit of a truncated version, but to cut it short, I got in touch with the UK authorities and they agreed with me that they said it was very unlikely that someone would be reported, someone would be fined, sorry, for having photos on a device if I had Russell's photo, say, and he hadn't given me permission, but I need it to be able to talk about Russell. However, they said that you still need to do the right thing. If you're an organization that's providing devices and loaning devices for individuals, you still need to make sure that you're doing everything you can to protect that data and meet the spirit of the privacy laws, even if your primary purpose is to uphold that individual's rights. So the right thing, and again, sorry, this is the UK version, that's all I know. I wasn't prepared for this to go and research everybody's data laws. I'm going to leave that up to you. But we have two things called lawful basis and legitimate interests. If you're in an EU country, this is the same because we've just, even though we're not in the EU, we've just nicked the GDPR law and made it our own now. So this basically means that you've got to know that it's lawful what you're doing and have a legitimate interest for doing that. I can't be putting data on without fully checking out that it's the right thing and it's a legitimate thing for me to do. There's also a law, part of the law, which states about having the minimum data possible. Now, this is really hard to judge, and we will I won't talk about at length about this, but you can imagine some of the implications of this. We need to carefully weigh up, if we're lending a device to an individual, what's the language that they will need. And it's not necessary, I would say it's not for us to say what's the language that they will need, it's for that individual to have all the language that they would need on. So just because they've moved, say, from a school into a college, and it doesn't mean that we should take off all the photos and information about the people who they were at school with, because they might want to talk about the people who they used to be at school with, things like that. So we must also do our best to prevent loss, and we must have a procedure for lost data. So all these things need to be in place in terms of doing the right thing. We can't just say, right, well, someone's rights outweigh that, we can forget about the law, because that will get us into trouble, and including the last part, reporting any breaches if they happen and sticking to the law for that. So at Beaumont College, we came up then with a process for data and AAC to meet the requirements when things like this happen. So this is rather complicated. Sorry, I'm going to zoom in so you can see it a little better. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but it will be provided in the slides, which I think Franklin's going to share. But really, it's just a flow chart, so we can ask some questions and make sure that everybody who's involved in providing devices is aware of the process. So first question we're asking is, does the communication aid belong to the college, or does it belong to the learner? Well, if it belongs to the young person themselves, then it's not covered by the data law. But I would still say good practice involves, if we need to assist that individual with their device, we should follow it, the process, as if it does belong to the college. We should advise that individual on how to protect their own data and the data of others that they have on their device. But it's less critical for the rather large fines I mentioned. But then a quick process, again, I'm going to go through a few points of these, but making sure it's inventoried, all the hardware stuff that we should be doing anyway. Critically, from a data protection point of view, making sure it's set up on a management system so it can be locked and wiped remotely. And then thinking about things, if you have an iPad and you want it to be encrypted, it's not encrypted unless you've got a passcode or a way of locking it with your fingerprint, say. But for most individuals using AAC, they don't want to be putting in a PIN code every time they want to say something. It might be a fingerprint's easier, but if we're going to not have that encryption on the device, we need a documented reason why. We need to make sure anyone who's working in the college is aware of the procedure if the device goes missing. Again, to the individual, they might not think that that is important if they're the device user, but staff need to know how to report, what to do, i.e. reporting back to someone who's got control so that it can be wiped remotely. And then thinking about and this is the tricky one, thinking about all the data on device as being necessary and functional for the learner's communication. And I managed to, we have a phrase, slopey shoulders. I managed to pass that on to SLT to be able to talk to the individual and decide what is necessary and functional on the device. It's a minefield as to that, but we should be able to defend the fact that we have minimized the amount of data that might be going missing. The other thing that's worth mentioning on this is we talk a lot, and because we're talking about data, we think digital data the whole time, and we think about digital information. It's worthwhile noting that all of this data protection should apply to printed information as well. And in the UK, and I suspect in the rest of the world, the vast majority of data breaches are paper data breaches, i.e. someone's taken a big file of information and they left it on the train. And that's a much bigger, a much higher proportion of data breaches than the data getting lost. And people forget that because when we say the word data, we think digital. So I try to say the word information rather than data. So it's worthwhile thinking about this. Again, when it comes to printed information, if you're printing out communication books for individuals to use, again, that's going to have a lot of data in it, and that might be sensitive data that needs protecting. So that's about me. I just wanted to give a final piece of advice. Again, this is probably for individuals who are working in organizations. Think about your procedures before this sort of thing happens. I'll hold my hands up and say we had a vague procedure in place before John's iPad got stolen from the locker, but they weren't set in stone. And this made us get them sorted, and I would advise you to do the same. So that's me. I'm just wondering, Tracy, if there's any immediate questions on that or whether I can just hand over.
There are quite a few. Some have been asked and answered. Somebody's asking, how does that compare to somebody getting a hold of my yearbook with the names and photos in it? And some of the comments are that you made a choice to be in your yearbook. The information on the iPad was not intended to be public. People make their choices to put information on social media.
It's true, yeah. I'd say, and like I said, for a lot of people with just their name and the photos, they weren't bothered. The critical data more is probably John's individual data about himself, because he didn't have the capacity to decide necessarily whether that went on or off. He could make choices about people he wanted on and off, but in terms of, he just wanted to talk about his birthday, he wasn't aware of the data implications.
Phil, do you know, or can you confirm if the GDPR for UK and Europe are still the same now following Brexit?
Yes, because I looked a couple of days ago because I knew that question would come up. It is temporarily following Brexit. I think it will change before too long, but basically we took that whole law and just made it it's called GDPR brackets UK. But so it's identical for now, but it will probably change.
Great. I think we'll leave it there for now. There's some other good questions that we'll leave for the end part. So
Great,
we're
thanks.
going on. Thanks, Phil. And we'll go on to David Niemeijer.
All right, let me share my screen and get my slides going. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Yeah. So thank you for having me on this this panel. I love data, but I also care a lot about privacy. And earlier this year, I actually wrote a blog post about that topic that was partly the trigger for this webinar. When I started writing that blog post, I did obviously some research what had been written before, and I didn't find a lot that was specifically focused on AAC and privacy, especially not much from AAC user perspective, except from Alyssa. And so I look very much forward to hear her story after mine. I'm David Niemeijer. I'm the founder and CEO of AssistiveWare. We make Prologue2Go, Prologue over Text, and several other apps. If you want to reach me, this is my Twitter handle. So our perspective is that AAC users have an absolute right to privacy. AAC users, more than anyone else, depend on their device, an electronic device, to express their most personal and intimate thoughts. And because of that, I think it's really, really important that they can rely on that device to keep what is private, private. And that whatever is said should stay in the room in which it's said and not be accessible later through the device. And I think it's important to take that perspective, not just for adults, but also for children. And I know that sometimes people like parents, they may like to police the language of their child. And whether it's about a parent or a teacher or a therapist who wants to do that, I think it should be done in the same way for a speaking person and for an AAC user. And a device that an AAC user uses is for their communication and should really never be turned against them by inspecting what was said before and then policing the language. Now, one of the reasons that this whole topic came up is because there are quite a lot of ways in which data is used in AAC. And one that has been mentioned already several times is automated data logging. And this is something that basically entails capturing everything someone says, every word, every letter, and every sentence spoken, and timestamped. And this is captured in a log file that can be exported from the device for further analysis. Obviously, it's not on by default when a device ships, but it can be turned on, it can be turned off. But it's a method of data capturing that captures a lot of detail and a lot about what someone says. Now, there are good reasons why this was introduced. These data logs are really valuable for AAC research. They are also really valuable for therapists to be able to get insights into language use of AAC users and support their language development further. So it's certainly true that any form of data capture and data logging has its pros. In the case of automated data logging, the fact that it's complete, that it's automatic, and that it is really easy, obviously is a really big pro, as are some of the insights that you can gain from it. But from our perspective, there are also quite a few cons. And there are two groups that I want to focus on right now. The first is that there's a lack of context. If you use automated data logging, you're not going to capture multimodal communication. And in essence, what you're capturing is the language, but not the full communication that may be taking place. You're also not capturing both sides of the conversation. These are things you do capture if you use a slightly lower text solution, for example, video recording or observation and making notes. The context of the communication partner competencies and the environment, they're also not included, except of course if you do the data logging during a session where you're present yourself. But these contexts are really important because a lot of what you capture in terms of language is influenced by that environment and by the communication partner. For us, the biggest concern is about privacy. It was already mentioned by some other speakers that it's really important to provide consent. And in practice, legally, that consent is provided by parents or guardians for minors. But as Dave Hershberger pointed out, it is good to not just ask consent to the parents, but also to the children. One of the challenges with consent is that people need to have a thorough understanding of the implications of the data collection. And what you may see is that someone who really wants to collect that data may emphasize the benefits and not necessarily some of the drawbacks of collecting data and some of the risks. An AAC user, if they're asked whether they consent, if they actually are still struggling with language, they may also have a difficulty either fully understanding the question or being able to fully express their opinion about it. Finally, using consent as a tool to protect privacy has its risks. Because basically what you're saying, we have some policies in place and we have some access restrictions, like an account that you need a password for, that protect your sensitive data. But if there are policy breaches or if access is obtained some other way, that means your sensitive data is exposed. So I would say that consent is better than nothing and makes sense in the time when we started with this whole concept of logging data as a way to protect privacy. It's not abuse proof and therefore it's not enough. Automated data logging is actually done by a lot of popular AAC apps and devices. But we decided that we don't do it and won't do it because we think the invasion of the user's privacy is too big. And even though we see a lot of values to the data that's collected, we think that this form of complete data logging should not be used. As also Dave Hershberger already mentioned, there are other ways data is used in AAC. This is, for example, product analytics, which is about capturing user and usage data for a product. You can have it with user identification or anonymous, as already pointed out also by Dave. And it's used to improve products, for example, to see whether features are discovered, whether they are used the way they're intended, or to support basic business operational processes like improving retention. There are several AAC vendors that use product analytics, and we are among those. In our case, we only use anonymous data for analytics, and for anything but the most basic operational data, we ask for consent. And even if you give consent, we still continue to focus on just anonymous data. Something that was also alluded to by Dave is that there have been a lot of developments in our thinking about privacy as well as technology. And one of the things I think would be really good if it was more adopted within the AAC field is some of those best practices from today's standards of privacy. And one of those is focusing not on privacy by policy, but by design. And some of the biggest things you can do to protect privacy is to, first of all, only collect essential data. Whatever you don't truly need, it shouldn't be collected. And whenever possible, aggregate and anonymize data to protect people's privacy. Because in the end, every piece of data that leaves the device poses a privacy risk. So the less data that leaves the device and the less detailed that data, the less the security risk and the privacy risk. So if you compare the traditional approach versus the privacy-centric approach, on the left, we have the traditional approach where Kim, an AAC user, uses her AAC device. Then Rita, an SLP, exports the log file. She's able to read that file, but it's a file that's not going to help her that much to analyze it by itself. So she feeds it into some analysis software, and in the end, she gets a report. That report has the information she needs to look at how she wants to further support Kim. In a more privacy-centric approach, Kim is also using her AAC device. But in this case, data never leaves the device and all analysis is done on the device. The only thing that Rita can export in this case and review is a report. She does not get access to the underlying data. So Rita doesn't know exactly which words were used in what order at what time of the day, but she can get insight into what parts of speech or how many words per week were produced or many other things that she might be interested in to support the AAC user. There are quite a few things that speech therapists like to be able to get from these kind of data, this kind of data collection. And I took a photo here of a section of a recent article that was published earlier this year on language sample collection and analysis with an AAC. And the highlighted measures are all things that for this article they wanted to measure. And I would argue that all of these could be computed on the device and aggregated over time and be obtained therefore without actually having access to a full log. And that obviously means that the AAC software needs to be adapted to actually do the processing of the log inside the device rather than outside of the device. Given that we really care a lot about privacy, we established some data collection principles. And the first is to only collect data if there is a clear purpose. So not just because it's interesting or because we can collect it. To ask permission for collecting data for product improvement, and only the most basic operational data we collect automatically, but everything else is only if you give permission. Only collect anonymous data, so never connect it to email account IDs or anything like that. Do not collect more detail than necessary. So for example, if we're interested to know how much language produced per week, we do not need to know the same data per day or per hour. Very important also is to make sure that in that collection process, you do not capture any personal data. If we were collecting information that could potentially contain personal data because an AAC user spoke about a person or a place or used an email address, then at that point that anonymous data could be de-anonymized. So we need to make sure that we never capture anything that could lead to de-anonymizing the data. And kind of obvious, not share raw data with third parties. So in conclusion, we really believe that the data collection is a really valuable tool that can be used both to improve products and also to be used to improve AAC practice. For the AAC product improvement, we think that aggregated and anonymous data is sufficient, and it sounds like Dave Hershberger agrees on that one. And for the AAC practice improvement, we think much less detail than what is currently collected through automatic data logging in both AAC apps and devices would be sufficient. That does mean that some of the analysis features that are currently available in separate software would have to build in the main software. We think it's our responsibility as AAC developers and practitioners to safeguard the privacy of conversation of AAC users. And that means we need to rethink what data we collect. We think that the AAC field needs to reduce the amount of data and the detail of data that is collected. And that only by doing that, we can guarantee that AAC users, that what they say, when and where remains private. Obviously, it's really important to also involve AAC users in this discussion and look at what their perspective is. So to sum up our main point, we think AAC users have an absolute right to privacy that shouldn't be waved away through consent. And that was my contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Just a couple of questions before we move on to Alyssa. One is consent is a moving target. How do we ensure continued consent? In healthcare, we need to get consent for every encounter. How often should we consent for data collection be obtained?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, ideally the consent should be obtained from the AAC user. And that consent should be when it comes to data analytics, that should cover the analytics that is collected. If it comes to the use of data by, for example, a teacher or a therapist, I think it's really important that it's on an individual basis. I don't think it's appropriate to ask an AAC user, or for that matter, a family member for a younger AAC user to provide consent blanket for everyone around the child. But in the end, like I said, I think consent is not a great protection. In the end, I think it's making sure that a lot of the detail of when exactly the device was used, what exact words were chosen, should just not be available even with consent.
Mm-hmm. Another question, when does it become data logging if you have a history function to access recently spoken phrases, words?
To me, the key thing is, what is that feature designed for? We have a history feature or a recents feature in Ploak2Go, but it was designed for the AAC user to have quick access to things they said before. And it actually doesn't function well as a log. Things are not timestamped. If you say something again that you've said before, it pops up and it comes to the front of the queue again. But also that can be turned off and it can be cleared. So it does have some privacy risks, but at least the design is such that it's really geared towards the needs of the AAC user rather than data collection needs from people outside.
Perfect. I think we'll leave it at that for now and carry on with Alyssa's presentation. Thanks, David.
Badoop, badoop. Share screen. Screen. Here you go. I am going to be talking about AAC and privacy, same as everybody else. Hi, you heard a little bit about who I am before, but doctoral candidate defending my dissertation in 2 weeks and half an hour on brain-computer interfaces for people with ALS. I am a part-time AAC user. I use a bunch of things, including FlipWriter, Proloquo for text, and some tools that weren't actually designed for AAC in the first place. And no, I don't mean PhD student with autism, I mean autistic. So how do we understand privacy? Physical privacy, our bodies, our personal possessions. Depending on our disability needs, we may have more people getting up in our stuff than non-disabled people. So there's going to be some invasion of privacy for that in all likelihood. Information privacy, likes, dislikes, conversations. As a researcher, I think that the idea behind an LAM file is kind of cool, but the amount that it collects is, one, way more than I actually need to look at, and two, I'm also an AAC user. No, absolutely not. You can't have that. So privacy as self-possession, as in control over the facts of my life, over my stuff, over who else does and does not get access to that. It's the decisions about who we do or don't let know things. So who controls access to our possessions and information? With consent, that's theoretically a protection on it, but if our parents can consent for us to data logging, and we can't actually get at the setting to turn off the data logging ourselves because of guided access, we don't have control ourselves in any way, and control is instead handed off to the group of people most likely to be our abusers. Disabled people face abuse at extremely high rates, and it is usually from family, caregivers, therapists, the exact same people who, in case of data logging, are frequently seeing our data. This actually means that if both data logging is turned on because of parental or caregiver consent, and guided access or some other method is being used to ensure that we ourselves cannot be the ones to turn it off, we've lost control of privacy in a way that even Facebook would let us keep. You can block your parents on Facebook if you really want to. You can block your therapist on Facebook, and probably should. So I think that there being privacy controls that are that's a problem. So looking at our design choices, LAM log files, super common, useful potentially, but if somebody exports the whole log file, they can see everything that I've said. And I could even get blamed for saying things that someone modeling on my device was actually the one to say. Excuse me, no. There's also default suggested information. This is actually a screenshot from Proloquo to Text on my phone, because I have it on all my devices. Suggested health information to have saved: diagnosis, doctor's name, doctor's number, insurance company, insurance number. No, I'm not putting any of those things on my iPad. Would you put any of those things on your iPad? My iPad is not exactly secure, and it would be very easy for a privacy breach to occur in this fashion. I understand why necessity may sometimes dictate that this information be saved in such a way, but the assumption that it will be there is somewhat concerning. Private use, clear history, clear sentence log. These are extremely important options to have available. If the guided access is turned, or other lock on the device is in such a way that the user cannot toggle these themselves, there is a privacy violation happening. And a justified privacy violation is still a privacy violation. Justified is in quotes for a reason. I don't actually believe most of the justifications are quite as important, or that the privacy violations are as unavoidable as they sometimes seem. You don't need to know what every word I used was to know I'm using my device to communicate. So that's my quick overview of congratulations. I don't trust parents, therapists, or caregivers by default. And in many cases, they are the exact people I would most like to prevent from knowing what people are saying. Like, those are often the people we need our privacy protections to be most held against. Thank you. Yeah, questions, I guess. And I cited Harvard Business Review today.
Thanks, Alyssa. There are no specific questions for you, but there are some that we certainly are going to want you to weigh in on here. Thank you, everyone, for all your various perspectives and significant knowledge on this topic. There's lots of discussion happening in the questions and answers, so it's a bit tricky to curate this, but I'm going to start with, it's one of the comments was about, there's a suggestion perhaps from, I think it was David Niemeijer, that AAC users shouldn't be allowed to collect their own data. So maybe we'll open it up with that bit of a interesting comment.
Well, of course, I don't know the exact background of the question, but I think an AAC user that wants to know what they said for the last hour, they could use a tape recorder just like anyone else. If they really want every little bit of detail of that conversation captured. If this is about having access to, you know, how much did I talk last week, or did I use a lot of core words? I mean, those kind of data can be analyzed on the device and be available to the AAC user just as to anyone else that has access to that device and access to that part of a piece of software. Yeah, so I don't see a reason why AAC users shouldn't have the same access and access in the same way as other people too.
Any other comments from the panel on that? There was another question about upgrading and getting new devices without transferring of vocabulary and data, and that came up when Phil was talking. And then there was another comment regarding that. Data backup should be good practice, but often it's not considered, especially when users of AAC move from one device to the next. I would contend that throwing away conversational data, for example, stories and Phil's examples of photos from previous settings, is unethical. Thoughts?
As I was talking at the time, I might weigh in. I totally agree with that, and it should, like I say, a truncated presentation, but it should go without saying that that device wouldn't have been wiped, and no, I wouldn't wipe any device without having a backup. I take the questioner's point that it isn't given as much weight as it should be, getting backups in place. It does, however, flag up another data issue, which I'm not sure whether we're going to get into that as well. But a lot of AAC backups now happening in the cloud on servers. And again, if permission should be sought for that, whether that's enough, David might have an opinion on that. But it makes it a lot easier. Most of us probably we're used to backing things up on USB sticks and things like that, which would probably a privacy nightmare. I've been in organizations where there's a drawer full of USB sticks that anyone could pick up and walk out with. So backing up in the cloud should be more secure, but as long as we know about the security of the servers and where it's getting stored, what country, etc.
That was one of the other questions. One of the questions was about comments about data storage in the cloud. What do other people have to say about that?
Well, obviously, cloud storage has the benefit that there's less of a likelihood that you totally lose something because you could get it again on a new device. I remember when Prolog2Go came out first, I heard stories of horses trampling on an iPod Touch or an iPad ending up in a swimming pool, those kind of situations. And it's obviously really important to have a backup of a device, especially when it's been heavily customized. Cloud storage obviously also brings its own risks. But there are approaches that you can take to make things safer there. And I think Dave also mentioned encryption, for example. But yeah, there are many aspects that you need to keep an eye on, and you always need to find that balance between the benefits you can derive from it and the risks that are involved. And I think that to me is a key thing. This should be about the benefits and the risks that revolve around the AAC user primarily, and a little less about the people around that AAC user.
So one of the other questions was, in Canada, this individual is talking about a rental program for speech generating devices and iPads and the like. And when they get their devices back, often folks forget their passcodes and Apple IDs. Any suggestions for dealing with those situations?
I would say if it's an Apple device, push the problem to Apple. And if it's a non-Apple device, push it to that manufacturer, because yeah, these things happen. But with some of those things there's just not much that we, for example, as app developer can do to solve that. And I know that people sometimes believe that if their credit card was declined on the App Store, that they can contact us and we can resolve it. But Apple is really strong about privacy too. So we don't get access to that information. In fact, we don't even know who purchased it. We just get a report on that day, X number of people in that country purchased something. And I think that's one of the areas that Apple's really strong, is in making sure there are a lot of privacy protections. That sometimes makes things more complicated. But in the end, I think it's also a good example to try and follow and find ways to deliver the same value that we're looking for example, in terms of insights into language use, language development. See if we can find ways to deliver that same value, but reduce the risks to privacy.
And I think this question also sort of reinforces why this is an ongoing conversation that we need to have. You know, I think two frustrations that we have with data. One is if there's data that we need that's no longer accessible, either because we don't have the password for the file, or it, for whatever reason, it's not available. And we particularly see this when, you know, as was mentioned before, when a person moves from one device to the next, having to start over on that next device sort of from scratch can be very painful. But on the other hand, the risk is also when someone gets access to information that that they shouldn't have. And I think part, you know, this is not just AAC, but in general in the data world, it's how do we walk with that, and how do we weigh the risk back and forth?
Nothing else on that from the panel? There's a question about it says data analysis within the device adds battery and processing time. How do we balance privacy and efficiency of the device?
My guess is that in practice, that amount of work that goes into analyzing the data on the device relative to everything else that goes on those devices is minor, but I don't have any data to prove that point right now, but that would be my hunch.
I mean, I know that iPads and computers can do language modeling, learning from what a person uses without spitting out logs of everything a person said, because I know Chinese. And just about every Chinese language input system that's based on Pinyin has a language learning model where it learns from what characters a person selects, because there's a bunch of different characters that all have the same pronunciation. Even more once you're flattening it out for Pinyin, because we're not having tone marks. When I get a new device, if I type out the Pinyin, the pronunciation for my name in Mandarin, I'm going to get suggestions that are nothing like the characters that are actually in my name. But after I go through, type it out, and track down the correct selections 5 or 6 times, first thing that pops up will forevermore be the 3 characters in my name in Mandarin. I do not have a log anywhere of all the characters that I've typed in when, but my computer managed to learn it, and so did my iPad, and so did my iPhone, all separately. This can be done. The question is whether or not it has been implemented yet, and whether or not doing that while not making this log is a priority.
I think there might be something to add to that, Alyssa, as well, in that it's sometimes hard to tell what processing is going on the device and what processing is going on in the cloud. So to take probably for my limited brain, a simpler example than yours, if you use the word prediction that's built into a Windows device, it's processing a lot of that on the Microsoft servers, because it's working on standard language makeup, standard sentence. So for you, what I'm trying to say is, for users themselves of devices, it's really hard to know, because so much relies on off-device processing. What's happening where? Sorry, say that again.
One of them learned, my laptop actually learned it when I didn't have an internet connection, because I was in China and didn't have the proper usernames to get online.
Yeah. And that's great. And you know that because you're highly technically able, and you can go, oh, I can see that this processing is happening. For a lot of people, it's really a grey area, and it might be happening some and some. So we maybe need to pay attention to that as well as to where it's happening, all this processing, before we even get to the log of it and where the log goes. Sorry, I just seem to be asking more questions and giving answers, sorry.
And I think that's part of what this discussion is leading to. Like, there are very, very many questions. Melanie's nodding and asked us lots of very good questions in your presentation as food for thought. So I did want to say this one comment, Alyssa. It says, thank you so much for conceptualizing privacy within the reality of abuse. It happens and it shouldn't be taken very seriously. So I wanted to make sure that that comment got made. Melanie, did you have something to add to the previous conversation? Okay, sorry. So I'm going to change gears just a little bit. What about the legal implications about accessing data across borders or running into different legislation and laws across countries? We've heard a little bit about that from Phil in the UK. No thoughts.
I don't want to keep. I don't want to keep talking. Please, somebody else talk. One good example of this might be Grid 3 software. If you want to do a cloud backup and cloud sync, you have to pair it up with Dropbox to do that. And Dropbox's statement, I think, says something like, your data may be stored in the EU, the US, or anywhere else in the world. And I think probably just the last bit could have come, they could have summed that up just by saying anywhere in the world, but they seemed to. So for someone who's agreeing to have their data stored across, they're then agreeing to have their data stored across borders. It could be anywhere in the world that Dropbox choose to put it. So that needs to be made clear, I think, to individuals when their data is getting processed. That again, we said there's massive advantages to that if the device gets lost or we need to shift to a different device. But the individual should also be aware that their data may just end up anywhere in the world. They may not care, but they may.
Anything else on the different jurisdictions? And there's a comment about raising issues in different governments when different human rights in different countries are not necessarily at the forefront. So who's getting all the data?
Well, I would argue again, if you make sure that a lot of the more private and sensitive data doesn't leave the device, then you don't have a lot of these issues. But I think the one exception where it's really hard to prevent that is when you're talking about like the backup of a vocabulary. You can't properly back it up and say it shouldn't leave the device, but you can encrypt that backup so that if it gets in the wrong hands of the wrong government or something like that, people can't use it. But I think it's also important to go back to something Alyssa said. The biggest concern is not some foreign government wanting to know what you said. There are plenty of ways governments apparently are able to find out what people say. It's about those people around you and their access to your private conversations. I think that's the bigger issue in many cases.
What else? All right, there's some great chat on the questions and answers, so hopefully we'll be able to capture that, because I think there's some things that we might want to capture to follow up on in another event, perhaps at Isaac Connect. So if we don't get to the questions today, we're hoping to be able to follow up on some of these things and maybe just have the conversation continue in a little bit more detail and depth at Isaac Connect. It's trickier to have these kind of conversations through a chat. So if we can set up a situation that folks can be actually communicating with one another back and forth and not having me as a moderator, that might get some of these questions and very important points out to the forefront a little bit better. One of the things that was coming up, Melanie, when you were talking was about the generational differences, and people were asking, I think, about what the age group was in your study. And one of the comments is, you know, from an AAC user is like, we wouldn't want all of our data logged 24/7, and that's a very good point to be had. But I wonder about generational differences in how we view privacy for all of our information, AAC users included.
Our study included.
Oh, Melanie.
Can you hear me better now? Our study included individuals who were 50 to 90 years old, because adults are the population that experience the degenerative neurologic diseases that we included. So yes, that is an issue. I think another issue that is critical is the people that we interviewed have had successful communication for all of their life. We did not have any autistic adults who also experienced disabilities. We would love to include individuals who also had the neurological illness, but they did not show up in our sample. But the perspective of individuals who are losing their ability to speak is one that we can learn from a lot, because they can tell us what was successful for them and what should be included as far as logging or saving what vocabulary they want. So it's yet another example of a population. But yes, there will be a generational difference between the younger individuals, especially those with who have experienced developmental disabilities and are learning to use AAC as a major form of communication, compared with those who have used speech and are losing that ability now.
Thanks.
Yeah, adding a bit to that, the expectations that somebody might have of privacy, in addition to the generational stuff, if they grew up and lived most of their lives as primarily abled, they're accustomed to abled people levels of privacy and control over their lives, not the levels that to which it is frequently ignored for people who grew up with known and identified disabilities. This is actually something that I run into a decent bit, because while my variable speech over time has been a thing for basically my entire life, the use of dedicated AAC devices and awareness of AAC communities is something that started when I was already an adult. So I'd grown up with fairly typical abled people level expectations of what my privacy would be. I look at an LAM log file and go, oh my God, absolutely not. And the idea that, like, and this informs my ideas of privacy, I assume that similar expectations are likely informing people with the ideas of people whose disabilities were acquired later in life, at least as much as it's affecting that, as it's informing someone who's had the disability the whole time, but only started using the technology later.
Thanks, Alyssa and Melanie. And that kind of brings to there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat from clinicians, speech pathologists primarily, I think, about needing to collect that data for their assessment purposes, looking at morphology and syntax to be able to justify authorizing devices and such. So have not being able to do it in that way. For example, if an individual user said, I don't want you to look at my LAM file, they're asking, how are we going to make clinical decisions? Like, again, more questions than answers maybe, but does any of the panel want to weigh in on that clinical aspect? Also, you sort of alluded to it at the beginning. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. There you are.
I'm sorry, I moved my camera. I was switching monitors because I needed a bigger monitor. It was getting a little small. Yeah, I think what folks are talking about there is that general concept of language sampling analysis, that actually what you're looking at with the words is the stuff of language itself. I mean, the frequency of the use of the words is interesting. When it happens is interesting. I think what people are looking for is how that, how those words are being used, and what does that tell us about the language. So for example, David's example there with John is stupid. So I jotted that one down. Now, to me, I look at that phrase, John is stupid, and it's positively dripping with linguistic information that I just can't not see. So I look at that straight away and say, well, crikey, here's a sentence that's got at the clause level, a subject, a verb, a complement. It's also a subject complement. It refers back to the subject. So when we talk about stupidity, it's referring back to John himself. The verb is there is being used at the phrase level as a verb or a copular form of the verb. The word stupid is being used as an adjective at a different level, and it's being used following a copula. So John is stupid, as opposed to if my client had said stupid John. If they had said stupid John at the clause level, that's a subject. There is nothing else, but it's an adjective plus a noun. So it's an adjective used attributively, adjective noun. Now, these are features of language that are important. These are things that I want to know about. I want to see how people are using it. I want to see that if folks are using the word stupid, do they use it before a noun? Do they use it after? Do they use it as the base form? Do they use it as comparative? Do they do the superlative? Do they say stupider or stupidest, or do they say more stupid and most stupid? And by focusing in on some of these, we can learn an awful lot about how the language itself is being used. And that's really what language sample analysis is all about. It's looking at the words themselves and trying to learn what's going on and what's happening, because we can identify how people are using their language. And that will also give us some ideas about where we might want to look next with them. And incidentally, I think the other thing that came up earlier, which is also a good point to mention, and people remind me of this as well, that if you're going to do language sampling of any sort, you do need to decide when and how you're going to do it. I think this notion that people turn on the logging feature 24/7 and then just go trawling for data is certainly a way of doing things, but typically not the best way of doing it. I think what a lot of people find they do is they do that. They do sampling. They take a sample here, go away, do a sample here. So having purpose, which again was mentioned here, what is the purpose for what you're doing, the sampling? And the purpose is I want to look at the structures of the language. I want to see how those words are being used, and I want to see how those words change in relation to where they are being used, because that's as I say, the stuff of language. That's really what I'm looking at. So I think the folks who are commenting there, particularly the speeches, I shouldn't even say speeches because we're speech language therapists, and this is where the language bit gets you excited. I think the folks who are commenting there are really commenting on what they get from this, which is they get to do a lot of detailed analysis about the structures of the language itself. That's all I want to say.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think what you're doing there with those 3 words, that's really very, very interesting. And you're getting a lot of those from those 3 words and how they were grouped together and what forms were chosen. But I'm wondering what percentage of speech language pathologists actually uses these log files? And of those that actually use it, what percentage throws that through a system like realized language and then uses the output of that, rather than getting all that rich information that you're getting from that combination of those three words? Because I mean, from a research perspective, you have something, even with those three words, that a researcher might be drooling on. But the question to me is, will most speech pathologists need that level of detail, and do they actually, and then the question becomes, if they don't need that level of detail, shouldn't we provide them the higher level information, plus what does that mean kind of information, rather than expose potentially every AAC user that uses a system that supports automatic data logging to all that data that can be collected, but that only is used by a small number of people. So I'm really interested to know, what your assessment is of how many people use this data logging and how many actually go to that level of detail of a sentence rather than use analysis software.
Oh, I think there's, I hate to say a lot of, I mean, I can't give you any numbers, and I actually can't give you any real numbers, because as part of our security and privacy goes, then I don't actually have any access to some of those numbers. All I know is that somebody has an account. I don't actually have access to how many people are being tracked. I don't have access to the data unless somebody shares that. So, I can't give you numbers. What I can say is that I think, I regularly talk with many people who are using data. And I think you're right. I think they use it at different levels. There are the folks who will take one sentence like me and pass the bejesus out of it and just say, wow, this is great. There are others who look at more general patterns within the language. And so they're looking at slightly different measures. And you referred earlier to the recent study where they were doing the measures, things like MLU, etc. And so some people will go to the detail of getting those. So there's a variety, I think, of ways in which people use that data. But for me, I think the reason that I think that it's important to have access to the words is because that's where you find what it is that you're looking for in terms of the way in which language is developing. And let me also go back to a point earlier, which is perfectly true, and I start any of my webinars with this, is that the data you get is the data you get, and there's stuff missing. There is stuff missing. I mean, I don't see the other side of the conversation. So you see a certain slice of data, and you can't go ahead and just, make fast assumptions on that. What you can see is the data that you get, and you can see the structures that are there. So bearing in mind that we know there are various limitations on it, for me, the important part, I think, is that this is, as Dave Hirsch mentioned, it's a tool that some people find particularly useful in order to do some serious analysis of language capabilities and abilities. And that's part of the reason that we do that is because people want to have that capability.
I think that we have to stop at that. Unfortunately, we're really getting into the nitty gritty here. That will be a really good conversation to continue at Isaac Connect in the summer. So I'm going to thank everyone again for attending. Don't leave though, because I'm passing it over to Franklin now for the draw prize.
So thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you, of course, to all of our panelists today. Your efforts, energy, ideas, contributions are all very much appreciated. I'm just going to go back to a comment that David, you made earlier about being a numbers guy. I'm with you. I'm a numbers guy too. And I'd like to, at the risk of taking a moment or two, just explain to everyone about our prize draw. And as Tracy alluded, Isaac will be holding its first ever all virtual event this August 9th through 12th. And we look forward, we will be opening registration likely this week. So please stay tuned and keep an eye on the website, and everyone will be receiving email notifications and social media notifications as well. So it's shaping up to be a fabulous event, and we hope everyone will join us for that. Today's prize draw is for one of our attendees, and sorry panelists, as a panelist, you're not eligible to win. And sorry, Tracy, as Isaac leadership, you're not eligible to win. And I'm not eligible to win as Isaac staff. So it's just for our attendees. And as I said, I downloaded the registration data. And in order to try and randomize this choice as much as possible, what I did was I let the computer generate 10 sets of random numbers for each registrant. And between those random numbers were between 1 and 100. Those numbers were all totaled, so each 10 numbers were summed. And the attendee who reached a score of 659 or less, the highest, the one who achieved, sorry, closest to 659 or less will be our winner today. And you may ask why 659? Well, the number 660 here at Isaac is a number we use. It's one of those magic budgeting numbers that we use. So without further ado, the individual who did achieve a score of 659, in other words, one less than 660, is from beautiful Puerto Rico, Maria Hernandez Maldonado. Congratulations, Maria. You have just been awarded a free member registration to Isaac Connect later this year. So we do have your email address because data privacy doesn't allow me to give that on this webinar, but we will get in touch with you. So congratulations. And I believe that then takes us to our final wrap up. And yes, Isaac Connect, here's, you can find more information on our website. You'll see a drop down at the top that is categorized as Isaac Connect, and there's the Isaac Connect email address. And of course, if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome to get in touch with either myself or send an email to feedback@isaac-online.org. This session, as Tracy noted, has been recorded, and we will be posting the recording on Isaac's YouTube channel and on our website. So Tracy, I will pass it back to you if you have any final thank yous, but I just wanted to again say thank you to Alyssa, David, Phil, Melanie, Russell, and Dave. Thanks again very much, everyone, for your contributions and your time and energy. And we hope to continue this discussion at Isaac Connect.
Thank you all very much. I have nothing further to add. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening or morning.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.